Jewelry can say many things on your wedding day. As a wedding band, it can say, "This is a forever symbol of our forever love." As a gift to your wedding party, it can say, "Thanks for standing up there with us." Blue Nile can help you find the piece that says it all and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com.
The Athletic.
Coming up, as the fight at the front gets closer, we look at the relative strengths and weaknesses of F1's current Big Four teams and ask which of the remaining tracks should suit them best. Plus, we answer 2 more questions from listeners, which this week are on tyre management and wheel tethers. Welcome to the F1 Tech Show. I'm Edd Straw, and if you notice that we skipped a week, you aren't going mad. We decided to push the schedule back by a week because we wanted to bring you an episode after the Spanish Grand Prix, and because Gary Anderson is currently away. But fear not, we have an able stand-in for Gary, a man who hasn't designed any Grand Prix winning cars, but who is well up to speed on all things technical in F1. It's Mark Hughes.
Hello, thank you. Gary casts a big shadow, metaphorically and reality. But he's I hope he's enjoying his cruise, and we'll see him soon. But happy to stand in from just this once.
What's your equivalent of the Jordan 191 in your body of work?
Probably some of the rides I put in on my rally chopper when I was at my peak, about 11, 12. Yeah, I was very good at turning on the brakes and getting the weight forward, and not many people could do that. Most people tried to do it with the handlebars and fell off.
That's what we like to see, a little bit of technical insight. Obviously aware of that evenness and early age. But yeah, obviously a very able stand-in for Gary. And I thought it would just be worth us briefly, seeing as he's not here, saying something nice about Gary. Because obviously we've both worked with him for quite a long time on and off. I think you originally kind of got him into the more journalistic realm with Autosport, and then I've worked with him for a long time. So we know what he brings. And there's a great mind there, isn't there?
There is. There's genius in Gary, and it's not channeled in the way it would be in a modern Formula One team, and it's not backed up by the massive research and that's available, and data that's available to the teams, but. He's very intuitive, and he'll quite often latch on to something that actually becomes evident in as time goes on as being spot on. So there's a great mind there.
Yeah, the wind tunnel in his head, I like to refer to it as, is quite effective. But so it's very interesting, because obviously having worked with him for a long time. As people who listen to this podcast will know, he's very, very good at explaining things. You know, when you get slightly complicated things, and while it's being explained, it's really clear, and it's kind of, you've got it. And then, like, sometimes I'll just sort of think back to a few hours later, I think, well, I understood that while Gary was talking, and now it's kind of just sort of slipped away again. It's like when if you're reading a book about something complicated in science, and it's well written, and you grasp it for a bit, and then as you move away, you've got to go back. So
as real life takes over, and you have other concerns,
exactly,
it moves it to the inaccessible place of your brain, and you have to. Pull it back all over again.
Exactly. But it's always interesting. But it's great to have you standing in for him, even though you don't have a Jordan 191 of such fame. At least I'm sure in the stomping grounds of your youth, you're still spoken of as a great. But let's get into it.
That's an hilarious thought.
Still famous, of course.
Still graffiti on the council estate walls. Yeah.
Just this legendary name. You probably know only by a nickname, but no one knows you really. Like the Banksy of chopper riding. Anyway, we should probably get on with talking tech. And obviously, we had the Spanish Grand Prix. It's an important race for teams bringing upgrades. Traditionally, it gives us an idea of the pecking order, or at least the pecking order on a track of this type. But it has sort of shifted a little bit how representative Barcelona is under the current rules, hasn't it? It's representative, but it's not quite as universally applicable, is it? That's
right. That's a good way of putting it, because it still gives you the litmus test of how good the car is across the biggest range of conditions. So that, in the round, that is giving you a very big picture that more specialized tracks don't. But at the same time, it's not as typical a track as it used to be of the whole calendar. So while it still gives you a good measure of where your car is at, and some fascinating patterns have emerged as a result of last weekend being the race happened there last weekend. How much that translates to the global performance over the season is not as direct as it used to be.
Yeah, exactly. It's all down to that interaction that we're always talking about of aero characteristics and ride. And yeah, there's now you could sort of broadly in the old days divide the circuits into just a few different styles, but now it's much more subtle. And when you have a track like Barcelona with a broad range, where you've got there's one decently long straight, there's some very fast corners, some sort of brisk medium corners, and a few slow ones. It's a real challenge. But I remember last year when we spoke to James Allison in Brazil at the end of the season, he referred to this challenge, and there was a good quote he used, which is, if you've got a one-dimensional circuit, you can have a one-dimensional car, which is why you sometimes see cars being more overpowered on certain tracks because they can't get that good global compromise, but they're good in one thing. So you might be good at low speed and bumpy tracks. So those who are perhaps disproportionately strong at a track like Monaco. So Ferrari, for example, plays in very well there, but they struggled a bit more at Barcelona. So it's the eternal thing. I feel like with these cars, before you were kind of bumping into one fundamental limitation, which was how much downforce, how much consistent usable downforce can you put on the car? Mm-hmm. And as long as you had control of the balance, the aero balance and centre of pressure and all that, you're kind of okay. But these, you can get massive downforce figures quite easily, but getting massive usable downforce figures is almost impossible. So it's a much more three-dimensional challenge. You're butting up against different limitations. There's more of them to hit, aren't there?
Yeah, it's like a Rubik's Cube conundrum now, much more so than it was. And I think as the cars have developed, as the top teams have developed their cars in the 2 and a bit years of this set of regulations, it's become even more critical because they become good at getting down to an even lower ride height without introducing the bouncing, so they can get lower without introducing bouncing than they ever could before. But that's introduced a whole new range of problems in itself, and it's now trying to get that very low threshold that you can run on the ride height without it messing up the consistency of the balance across the speed range of corners. So it tends to, and the Mercedes was with its original wing, was the car that really showed this most clearly. You could have it so that you had, the front wasn't working well at low speed, so you had understeer, but it would start to work too well at high speed because as the car lowered under the downforce, it would begin working in ground effect and give you too much front end, and then the aero would migrate too much to the front and give you instability at high speed. So you had the worst of both worlds. So the breakthrough that Mercedes made with that front wing is tamed that trait, but it would be exposed most of all at a circuit like Barcelona, which is why it was such an important test for Mercedes and why I think they will have been so relieved that it was competitive, not as outright quick as it was in Canada, which is very easy because all the corner speeds are the same there. But it was competitive, and so I think they've now got a platform to work with. So I think of the leading 4 teams, they're the last to get in that ballpark, and each of the 4 teams has got slightly different traits and limitations around that, but they're all in the ballpark, and that ballpark was to get the low ride height without the bouncing, and then B, to have the consistent balance through the speed range.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when the ground effect cars came in, and we had the cars running in testing in Barcelona, wasn't it, in 2022 before we went to Bahrain, and you had the bouncing, and I remember there being there was some sort of smugness from some working in other championships saying, well, how could you forget about the porpoising and bouncing, and it's really simple and all that kind of thing. But what we're seeing over the past few years is we've never seen ground effect race cars refined to this level, pushed in this way. Yes, we've had extreme ground effect cars before, but the way F1 works with the detail and the really fine control of everything, and the sculpting of the tunnel ceilings and all these sorts of things, this actually is kind of the stuff that eventually F1 would have got to if we say ground effect was banned. Ground effect wasn't, but the Venturi tunnel cars, that they were banned in 83 with the arrival of the flat bottoms and only came back in 2022. But the extent to which it's being pushed has put them into almost some new science, isn't it? Because as you say, that they're running ground effect cars more aggressively than anyone probably has before. And that's where you get into all these challenges with the ride and the suspension and just pushing right to that limit.
Yeah, that's it. And it gets so, the aero behavior gets so volatile in those last few millimeters of ground effect and around the choke point of the underfloor, that controlling that and understanding it and having the mechanical aspect to sort of work around that is, it's very, very intricate science.
Yeah, which has made it really interesting for Formula One. Again, referring back to that James Allison interview, he said something like, well, the old cars, you could just keep adding downforce and you keep finding performance. And that just seemed to keep happening. They never really leveled off. But that's the other big thing we've got now. We're having question marks about, are we actually getting teams, specifically Red Bull, that's kind of towards the limit of what's possible under these regs. So those questions are going to be answered over the next 18 months or so as they continue to develop before the rule changes. But yeah, it's been a really, really interesting time. And I thought Barcelona was a fascinating weekend from that perspective, and it showed with some of the sort of the teams that have been having a dreadful time. Sauber, for example, suddenly had a car that qualified pretty handily. And suddenly, I would say you suddenly had two Alpines in Q3. It worked quite well. It was a track that worked pretty well for Alpine. They have been improving and they've got the weight off. So it just shows how suddenly you can have a car like the RB that looked really good and the Sauber that looked terrible. And they just sort of almost swap positions just because of the track characteristics. And we're going to keep seeing that, I think, as time goes on. Well, let's get into our main topic, and it's already something we've touched on, but it's that fight at the front. We talked about the performance convergence, so we thought it would be worth digging into the four top teams, Red Bull, McLaren, Mercedes and Ferrari, and we can really showcase the relative strengths and weaknesses of each, why we see certain teams being quicker at certain types of track, whether certain weaknesses are weaknesses that can be completely eliminated, what the ongoing development will be. So shall we start with Red Bull? Because start the season looking miles away from everyone in the race pace, and they still win most of the time, but under a lot of pressure, beaten by McLaren in Miami with a bit of luck, beaten by Ferrari in Monaco. McLaren could have won at Imola but didn't. Mercedes could have won in Canada but didn't, and McLaren could have won in Spain but didn't, which tells us something about the quality of the execution of Max Verstappen and Red Bull. But what does that tell us about the performance profile of the Red Bull and its strengths and weaknesses?
I think it tells us that Red Bull, that concept of car, which was introduced at the beginning of 22 and has basically just been evolved ever since, is the potential of it is flattening out. And as you say, that might just be about where you can get to, and they've got there first. And I think some of the traits we see exposed as limitations were disguised when Ferrari and McLaren in particular weren't able to provide that consistent challenge. But now that they can, and they force Red Bull to really try to extract a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, then you see where the difficulties arise. And we've seen it on curbs. It can't take the curbs very well. We've seen it on bumps, and it's for the same reason. And there's something about how stiff the platform is in roll, in lateral movement, combined with quite a long travel vertical movement of the rear suspension, which seems to trip it up, seems to not give the rear wheels the camber range needed to nicely accommodate those things. Now, that the payback for that fantastic platform control, of course, is its high-speed downforce. It's still absolutely the king of the really fast stuff, and we saw that in turn 9 and turn 14. Even when the car was struggling, it was still light years faster than anybody else through there. Now, as the weekend went on and everybody progressed and the track grip increased, not just from the rubber, but from the colder temperatures of qualifying, then you saw cars which had been a little bit marginal through there, like the McLaren, were suddenly able to get there as well. But if you're flat, you're flat, so you can't take advantage of the improving track conditions so much. So I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the car is aerodynamically still produces more downforce, and it has a great spread of downforce as long as you don't have to use the curbs very much, and as long as the track's relatively smooth. And but I think as they are, getting lower and lower and lower as in response to the others catching up, so we see that trait, which Mercedes has also suffered. We see that trait of a little bit of conflict between the balance in the low speed and the high speed, and that's what we saw at Imola, and we saw it again in Barcelona on both occasions. After practice, they've said, right, we need to rethink. We need to go to a different wing level entirely, and sort of regroup around that. So it shows that it's very, it's right on the edge. And the team is just pulling those performances out, and Max is pulling those performances out, but it's not easy. And
of course, we saw Max Verstappen have a go in the 2022 Red Bull RB18 to remind himself of what the ride was like in that car and whether they'd been made worse. They said that was part of the reason for it. I'm sure they experimented a bit with it. They tried it at Imola, which was obviously a challenge for them in terms of the necessity for curb riding and having to run a bit higher, and how do you balance that? But I'm very interested in this thing, because obviously you can talk about with Red Bull the ride being the weakness, and obviously they want to improve it. But it's understanding how much they want to improve that, because Paul Monaghan, the chief engineer of Red Bull Pedals, as he's known, was talking about that at the weekend, and he said, well, we won't fix that in deference to other qualities. So it's not just this is our one weakness. It's that three-dimensional challenge. So that's the really interesting question for me. Are they getting to the point where they are into that asymptoting, as it's said, sort of when obviously you get a sort of initially a sort of linear curve going upwards of finding performance, and then it gradually curves to get to this really shallow curve where you can find infinitesimally small things, but effectively you're running out of headroom within it. So it's that question of whether Red Bull's compromise is kind of the right one and they've just got to live with it while trying to fettle it a little bit, or whether there's more to come. And I guess that was the interesting thing about them going to the length of getting Verstappen into the 2022 car as part of that process, to make sure his feedback is high fidelity, and he's not just relying on a 2-year-old memory to compare it. He's actually got... he's in the car. He was in the car Wednesday before the Spanish Grand Prix, which for someone who's always complaining about how many race meetings there are, tells you how seriously he was taking it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also for his perspective as well, I'm sure, because when you're lapping half a second clear of everyone, the car's fantastic, isn't it? And you know where it's not quite so good and where it's better, but as an all-round package, you're not bothered.
And you can give away a little bit of that aero.
Yes.
Just say, well, we just put it up a little bit. If that costs us a bit of downforce, so be it. But now that they haven't got that.
Now you can't do that when you got McLaren and Ferrari and sometimes Mercedes snapping at your heels. Then that limitation becomes much more of a problem. And he did say in Monaco, which was when the problem really became evident. He said, it's not changed. It's been like this since 22. It's just we had enough advantage in the other corners that you couldn't tell. It was disguised, but we knew it was there. So I think it's just probably a bit of a reality check on that, as well as maybe experimenting with to see if there are ways of moving that limitation along a bit.
The impression I'm getting from the team is that they think their compromise is in broadly the right sort of place. So you're not going to suddenly see them working next year towards a super easy riding Red Bull, let's put it. And as we see, Ferrari have got something that's certainly at low speed and bumps and curbs can run quite well, but that has limitations elsewhere. But that's the tantalising question that we'll see over the next year or so, as to whether if there's another slightly different balance that has more potential in it, and only the stopwatch will decide that. But obviously the Red Bulls continue to upgrade. There are a few changes at the Spanish Grand Prix. The radiator inlet geometry changed, the engine cover side panels, a little bit of work with the floor as well. Sergio Perez, of course, has conspicuously gone missing, if indeed you can conspicuously go missing. Very fast car, but why do you think Perez once again is just disappearing, having been pretty handy as a number 2 to Verstappen in the first part of the year?
Yeah, he does seem to get thrown when the car traits change, and that's where he's fallen down the last 3 years. As they've developed the car, that it's actually changed the traits of it. It's not just the same but better. It's actually changed its balance and the way it behaves, which Max can just encompass effortlessly, but Checo can't. And this is one of those, and it's being made worse now because, as we've just been talking about, you don't have that little bit of headroom to just say, oh, let's just raise it a bit and just, keep the balance consistent, and then you'll get more from it than we're surrendering, sort of thing. That's not an option anymore because, if you're 3/10 off, that as we've seen, that can be you out in Q1. So, he's struggling, and they're throwing lots of different potential solutions at it throughout a Grand Prix weekend, and that's really that's the last thing he needs.
Yeah, but it seems to be the nature of the nature of the challenge when you've got a driver like Verstappen who's able to tolerate some tricky car characteristics, but that unlock plenty of speed. Should we move on to McLaren now? Obviously, McLaren and Lando Norris become Red Bull and Verstappen's biggest challengers in the championship. They've been selectively impressive over the past year or so, shall we say, but the car has become more of an all-rounder. So where do the strengths of that car lie, and how much have they shifted, do you think, in the past 6 months or so?
I think this car has become the best all-rounder in the sense that it's the one that would have the least, I would anticipate, have the least difficulty in being adapted to all the different circuits. I think it's going to be the most consistent performer. It should be somewhere near the front at all types of track, as things stand at the moment, and the current level of development. And I don't know if it's been a deliberate ploy to just to even out the peaks and bring up the troughs, or whether that's just the natural process of development that it's ended up following in their wind tunnel and in their simulation. But that, since it's Miami upgrade, that is it's the car which gets straight into the sweet spot, which pretty much is going to be there or thereabouts, and which enables the team to go in every weekend thinking we've got a very realistic chance of winning this race. I think they have a much less tense time getting into that window than Red Bull, and I think it's a more flexible performer than the Red Bull, even if it's not as quick at the absolute peak when you can exploit absolutely everything from the Red Bull. I think it's still the quickest. And it's not as good as a Ferrari in the low-speed mechanical corners, but it's not bad. And so I think it's this is a very, very strong car now.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the low-speed weakness of the car is something that's been talked about quite a lot, and that seems to have improved. From that Miami upgrade, they got a little bit more of an all-round improvement than they thought they would get, not just at the low speed, but the quicker speed ranges as well, and that was something they tried to understand. They seem to have it does seem a bit more balanced in that they've sacrificed perhaps the absolute peak of their fast corner stuff, because, for example, even though Lando Norris grabbing pole position, a big part of that was finding some speed in the fastest corners in Barcelona through, if you can get through on 100% throttle, you're going to find a bit of pace. That was partly because Verstappen was already there, so there was no more for him to gain. He'd already deployed all that pace, so McLaren found a bit more, but they still weren't quite at the Red Bull level in that. So, yeah, it interests me because at the start of the year, Andrea Stella said, I specifically asked him, how long is it going to take you to improve that slow corner stuff? And it was particularly long duration slow corners on the cars in Yor that it was really struggling, which is difficult with these cars. They're not the only ones struggling with that. And he said that to get to the point where it's a proper all-round car is going to be at least a year from now. Mm-hmm. And then they've made this progress. So I'm wondering, well, he's either managing expectations or they're sat there right now thinking there's a hell of a lot more to come from this car
Yeah, it's
over the next 12 months, while Red Bull are thinking, are we levelling off and are we in the right place? That's what I don't know what the answer is. We'll learn that, but that's tantalising, isn't it?
It is, and they are. Although all these cars are ostensibly quite similar on the outside, they all have quite different detail on the underfloor and how they're using that underfloor and how it's all joining up and how the suspension works around it. They're all quite different, so they will all have different potentials ultimately. And it is quite interesting. Is McLaren saying, well, it's still not as good on a slow corner as we think it could be, but we can just sort of set up our way around it, or have they actually stumbled into something where they think, actually, no, this is good. We found the performance in the slow corners that we thought was going to take longer. We don't know, but if it's the former and they think that there is more to come, which would open that window between the contrast that we're talking about between the high speed and the low speed, that's really going to pay back quite handsomely.
Well, the interesting thing here is obviously Red Bull have a huge amount of credibility, and kind of our expectation is Red Bull will stay right at the front because they're just such a good team. They've got very good processes. They've had a strong car right from the start of this. But I guess the one disadvantage you have when you're at the front is that there's a little bit less soul searching and looking into what you're doing. I mean, they're still doing it. They're not resting on their laurels, but McLaren obviously didn't start this rule cycle brilliantly, so they had to do a lot of work and research into areas, okay, what are we not understanding, etc. The team we're about to talk about, Mercedes, have had to do a huge amount of that because it's been a very, very long journey for them to kind of finally get onto this right trajectory. But you always wonder, has the struggles of some of the teams led them to stumble upon researching something that maybe Red Bull haven't had to, because it's not been flagged up as a problem for them. And that'd be something Red Bull will be looking for. Is there anything they might have found that we've missed? This is the whole development game that's going on, isn't it? Which I think is so interesting. But let's talk about Mercedes, because you've mentioned in the first part their progress. Obviously, the new front wing, they had that initially, the front wing that was sort of unloaded close to the nose on that top element, which helped to give quite a nice clean airflow to present to the front of the floor, which is pretty important, and it tackled that problem of the front wing becoming a little bit too pinned at high speed, and just you have the front having too much grip, and then the rear goes and there's your rear instability. But they went to the more orthodox front wing for Russell in Monaco, for both drivers in Canada. So where are they now? What are the team's strengths? Where is that car at its best? Obviously, we could assume Canada probably showcased the ideal for that car at this stage.
Yes, I think if you can, when you go to a track that has very little variation in corner speeds, it can be tuned into a very nice window. And I think you could make a strong case for the fact that it was the fastest car in Montreal. It's maybe a tenth off around somewhere more challenging like Barcelona, but they are in the ballpark now, and they've been in the ballpark, I think, since introducing that particular upgrade. And as I said earlier, I think they're the last of the four teams to really to get to that ballpark, and in terms because the challenges have been sort of, as they've been sorting out one challenge, the whole game has moved on and exposed a different challenge, and they've had sort of one step behind all the time, or half a step behind. But I think they are there now in terms of the broad understanding. It looks that way anyway, and so it's still not quite as good as a Red Bull in a high speed. It's still not quite as flexible as a McLaren. It's still not quite as good at the low speed as a Ferrari. But it's somewhere there. It's not, and I think it's within the noise of, if you can get the setup right and if you can do a mega lap, you could be looking at poles and victories. So not going into every race expecting that, but I think very realistic chance that both George and Lewis are going to be fighting for wins and pole positions in some of the races remaining.
Yeah, I'm certainly prepared to think that they have turned the corner now, and some will probably still be sceptical because they've had so many false dawns, haven't they, over the past couple of years, where they think they've made a breakthrough, then actually, no, it's just circumstantial or the track characteristics, but it does feel like they're into a normal process now, and it's just about the developments going on. But it means I asked George Russell after the race about the level of confidence, not just for this year, but it actually changes 25, because it wasn't long ago we were talking about Red Bull walkover in 25. No one could win, and if anyone was going to topple Red Bull, it sure wasn't going to be Mercedes on the trajectory there are. Now George Russell can kind of say, well, it's sort of game on for 25 without sounding like an idiot, which he would have done not long ago. Yeah. And that just must be such a relief. It's, obviously, although this is a tech podcast, but the technical endeavour is also a human endeavour, isn't it? And there have been so many people working so long and so hard, and they keep finding things and sorting them, and then you hit another problem, and there's another problem, and there's another problem. That they must have got to a point where they just, you back the process and you think you'll get there eventually. But I imagine there would have been moments where quite a few people are thinking, oh, this is just never going to end.
Yeah, I'm sure. You need to be really resolute and really be able to bounce back from your disappointments. A whole team of people as well, which need to be led to stop that feeling of defeat sort of permeating through the organisation, and that's when the tech director really earns his money, and that's what James Allison will have been going through and will still be going through, I'm sure. But that's it's a very difficult thing to especially when you've been so used to winning, and it's sort of become embedded in the culture for so long. So I would imagine it's been quite a challenging place to work at times.
Should we look at Ferrari now? Obviously, they were the clear second best for the first part of the season, but it's become a little bit more complicated recently. Canada, I think we can shrug off as an aberration. They're not on any normal weekend, not a Q3 car, so that was one that happened. But there was a reasonable upgrade in Barcelona, high downforce rear wing and beam wing setup, changes to the side pods and floor. Drivers were complaining about the high-speed corners, the bouncing in particular. We're asking Carlos Sainz after qualifying, he said, well, it's just there. It seems to be one of these persistent problems. So what's that limitation all about? Yeah,
so this is something that Barcelona sort of confirmed a little bit of, Sainz is thinking back to Japan and saying, hang on, we had this in Suzuka as well, not similar sort of corners. Yeah, it might be a trait of the car rather than just it was a difficulty we didn't get our heads around on that particular weekend. So it's, I think we talked how all the teams have got in the ballpark of getting the car very low while still retaining control, very fine control of the bouncing. Perhaps they're the fourth best at that, even though they're in the ballpark. They're probably fourth of the four teams at that, and they can trigger it earlier than the other three cars. And it just, but it's like a threshold. It's basically that floor edge at the back, sort of, which is quite near where the choke point of the floor is. If that just gets a little bit too close to the ground, so with a new set of tyres or a higher power mode, or you're leading a high corner, you're suddenly into the territory. And as we saw on Friday, when they were running the lower power modes, the Ferrari was quick. It was super quick. It was looked a potential pole contending car. And they only found out it wasn't when they switched up the power modes for qualifying. And all of a sudden, there it was. There's the bouncing. And just that little 2 or 3 kilometres extra in entry speed into the fast corners. And there, you've got it. You're into it. So then you're into that, right, on fast circuits. Are we going to have to look at running it a little bit high and surrendering downforce? Or are we going to have to, how do we get control of the bouncing? So, yeah, I think that's their main limitation. Their biggest strength, and they're probably the best of the 4 cars at the slow speed mechanical corners. They're very good on the brakes. They got lovely sort of early, the way that they pivot the car into a slow speed corner, both Charles and Carlos. It's lovely. And you see, when you look at the traces, you see it allows Leclerc in particular to do all sorts of tricks, overlapping brake and throttle, which you don't see the other ones doing. I don't think the other cars are tolerant of that sort of thing as the Ferrari. So
I also think Leclerc's very clever on that sort of thing. He is. Yeah, he does that stuff so intuitively. We're sort of drifting off that, but I remember him when these cars first ran in 22. He started to change the way he was braking and approaching without even really consciously knowing he was doing it. Yeah. And Sainz was trying to kind of do the same thing, but he couldn't. It was hard because Leclerc almost wasn't aware he was doing it. Amazing talent.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you see Sainz doing it now as well. I think he's sort of learned from studying the data, but the car is very tolerant of it.
Yeah.
And as a generality, the Pirellis don't really like lateral and longitudinal load at the same time, but the Ferrari, whether it's suspension dynamics or something else about it, I don't know, but it is more tolerant of it than any of the other top three cars. And allied to that, it's power unit format, which is it has a smaller turbo than the others, which gives a better response, and so you don't need to use as much electrical energy to fill in the gaps, sort of thing. And long inlet tracks, and that gives real punch, instant low down punch, and it's very, very good out of corners as well. You'll quite often, if you look at a color coded map and put the top three cars on, and you'll see which bit on the circuit each car is faster than, because it has the colors on. The Ferrari is nearly always the exits of the corners are nearly always red, because it's nearly always the Ferrari, even on circuits in which they're not particularly quick overall. So that type of circuit, like Monaco, Baku, I think they'll be really good. They're a very, very quick car, but I think at the moment it still requires a little bit more development. Now that development, the update that they came with in Barcelona amplifies what they already introduced with the previous update, in that it's cleared a greater space for the undercut at the front and for the Coke bottle at the back, which obviously creates more capacity. But I think until they've got proper control of the bouncing, that's going to be, you're not going to be able to exploit that fully. So I would guess their main area of priority is the bouncing.
Yeah, the bouncing is quite a hard limit. It's not really something you can live with it, but it's not something you can get around. It's just sort of there and has to be got under good control. And of course, Charles Leclerc also mentioned that made it harder on tyre management in Spain for them as well. Obviously, even over a qualifying lap, you've got to manage the tyres, and if you've got that bouncing, it's just putting extra energy into the tyres, isn't it? When you have to try and budget that energy input around a lap, just makes it even harder.
Yeah, that's right, and it's an aerodynamic phenomenon, and it's something which will require more fidelity in the management of the airflow at those very, very low ride heights and floor edge gaps, just to prevent the onset. Make it a bit later so that you can just run it that bit lower and get that last little bit of downforce, and that's what the other three, certainly McLaren and Red Bull, seem to have the edge at.
And this is where the mathematics gets pretty ridiculous, doesn't it, in terms of the complexity when you're really close to the ground. You're trying to get that fine control. It's been the big challenge of these. I must admit, I feel like Ferrari are the one that are at least close to the good compromise point, if you see what I mean, which worries me a bit. But it's the great thing, because ideally you want something that's as good as the Ferrari on a track like Monaco, over the bumps, etc., and the slow stuff with the mechanical platform, but they can also do what, say, the Red Bull can do on a high-speed aero track and all these things. So it's balancing up those multiple dials is the fascinating thing, and we still don't really know what the outcome of the perfect compromise is. So that's going to be the battle, isn't it, between it's these four at the moment, and it's conceivable others could join them. Aston Martin obviously have been struggling, but Fernando Alonso has been talking up their Hungary upgrades. If they can finally start putting upgrades on the car that doesn't cause characteristic problems because they're losing control of the aero migration at different speeds and that kind of thing, then we're seeing it's possible for there to be not quite a light switch moment, but almost a point where you can move into that realm. And if we are seeing the likes of Red Bull up near the top of what's possible, then we are going to see these other teams joining in. And suddenly we've got almost the utopia, haven't we, that was promised with these rules of convergence of multiple teams at the front.
Yeah, we better stop that quick. We need a new set of regulations to space it out again.
No, they wouldn't do that. Yeah, that's absolutely going to be the case. I guess it's worth briefly just looking ahead. We've got Austria and Silverstone coming up. Mm-hmm. Which car would you pick for each of those if you had a choice of which one to jump in and put your two-wheel skills to some four-wheel driving?
The McLaren, I think, but it's. I think we'll see a similar pattern as at Barcelona, where potentially that there is probably a better lap in the Red Bull than the McLaren, but you might not be able to get to it in the limited space that you have. And I think if you were looking for something that's going to be surefire to be competitive, I'd say the McLaren. The Ferrari high speed until they've got control of the bouncing, I think probably potentially going to be the fourth best team. And yeah, the Mercedes might be okay around Silverstone. We'll see. I think it should be somewhere in 100 Silverstone. Maybe not so much Austria. There's a bit of corner speed spread there. But yeah, I think the slightest little thing will change it. One little breakthrough in development, and you could easily have this. This could all be up in the air, and the status quo that we see after the end of the Spanish Grand Prix might look completely different at the end of Silverstone. It really is. It's that close.
Which is exactly what we want to see. And of course, you've got the confounding factors like temperature and that kind of thing, which temperature fluctuations can make a very big difference, particularly when you're talking about things very close to the ground as well. So there's all of these factors that this could actually be what F1 is now, with multiple teams and swings back and forth with conditions, and a really fascinating development battle, which is great for anybody who likes the tech of Formula One. Right, into the final sector of the podcast now, which of course is where we tackle questions sent in by you, our great listeners. We've got two for Mark to tackle today in Gary's absence. And remember, if there's a tech question that's been nagging you, send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. You can do that in written form or record it as a voice note on your phone if you prefer, and then we'll try to answer it on an upcoming episode. And of course, if you do record a voice note, make sure you include your name. So question one for you, Mark, comes from Alyosha, who says, I'm wondering why there is such a gap in the management between drivers of some teams, especially at Mercedes and McLaren. I can understand why some drivers are better over a single lap, as it requires seeking ever-elusive perfection, which not everyone can achieve, even at this elite level. But for tyre management, it seems like something that should be easier to learn than speed over a single lap, because to me, it appears that the margin of error is higher. The error here being the effect of tyre wear of any individual action. Why can't all elite level drivers master it?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, an interesting distinction as well. And I think if you're talking about the intrinsic raw speed of one driver versus another, that is just a physical thing. It's a talent, and it's the physiological reasons behind it. Whereas you're looking at tyre management, it's more of a craft. It's something which can be learned, but it doesn't mean that it's easy to learn. And when you're talking about something as non-linear as tyre degradation and inconsistent as tyres, how they degrade at different tracks and different temperatures and different compounds, it's incredibly complicated and, as I said, non-linear. So it's not a simple matter to learn it. And Max Verstappen, even in his first couple of years at Red Bull, wasn't that great at it. He'd be fine sometimes, and other times he'd just lose control of the temperature, and you'd have a weak race. And I remember him having one in I think it was Austin in 2019, where he just got into a big strop about I'm not here to finish fourth, and even Marco, his biggest supporter, said, well, you're not going to win championships unless you can get on top of this. So, you're going to struggle to win races, let alone championships. So it's something you need to get your head around. And he's now probably better than anybody at it, And it is like I say, it's a craft, and it needs to be learnt. And there is a physiological element in it, in that you need to be able to feel the sensations and understand what they mean and correlate it with what the engineer's telling you about the temperatures and the gradients of the temperatures and all those things. And as you get more and more experience, you get a better feel for those things, but you need to be aware of what it is you're trying to learn and what it is you're looking for. And it can take a long time. And I think the best drivers will get on top of it, but it's not an automatic thing like when you put an intrinsically quick driver in a quick car, he goes fast. And it doesn't matter about experience. He will be very fast, as we saw with all the greats, including Verstappen. So it's not like that. It is a learned skill.
And there's a great example with the two teammates at McLaren, Lando Norris. I think he's quite underrated for how much effort and thought he puts into things, and he's very good on tyre management. He's very good at working out how to apply it. And Piastri, obviously less experienced. This is something he's improving on. And this wasn't the big issue at the weekend in Spain. He just seemed to be all over the place for pace. They didn't entirely understand what was going on there because the fact that he's always quick and he just wasn't there. But time management's a big thing for him. And I asked him on Thursday ahead of the race about the how difficult it is to actually make that improvement. And he sort of said, well, even in your 10th season, you're going to be learning stuff because time management can be described as one thing, but it's actually 100 different things. It's what exactly is going on, graining, overheating, surface overheating, what's the core temperature, how are you using curbs. There's 1,000 things that you need to really kind of get into a point where you just know how to respond to those signals to adapt what you're doing. Sometimes you need to be really careful about how you bring the tyres in at the start of a stint when the tread depth is there's the most rubber there and it moves the most, because you can accelerate the deg of a whole stint just by doing that. And how is it wear limited? Is it deg limited? Is it the front end? Is it the rear axle? Is it one of those ones where it can switch between the two? All of these things, it's bafflingly complicated, and it's a fascinating thing to see. I actually think. The question said, why can't all elite level drivers master it? I think all elite level, by which I mean the elite of the elite, probably have to master it. And I think sometimes there are drivers in F1 who I just don't think buy into it. You hear teams being frustrated with them because they'll get to a certain level with it and think they've learnt everything and just stop learning. Or they're ones who just fundamentally can't quite get on top of it, no matter how much they try, at least not to the level of the best. So I know people don't like tyre management, and it's not the most exciting thing, but it's a fascinating challenge, and it tells you a lot about drivers. Our second question today comes from Michael Wilson from Australia, who says, in recent years, especially since the introduction of heavier wheel and tyre assemblies for 2017 and again for 2022, it seems we've seen more and more wheels separating from cars during crashes. The most recent example being the Perez K-Mag incident at Monaco. Wheel tethers are supposed to prevent this, but of course they can't be infinitely strong. In light of these failures, is it time the FIA beefed up these tethers again?
Yeah, but very well might be, Michael. I think this is something that the FIA is always monitoring very, very closely. It's not like the tick the box and move on. Wheel retention is probably right up there in terms of the safety concerns, and not least because it's not just a danger to the competitors, of course, as we've seen tragically over the years. So, I think any new science which is researched will be implemented without delay. You do tend to see the loads that they have to withstand increasing sort of year by year. But as you say, the wheels and the brakes on the wheels and the uprights have all only been going in one direction over the years, is heavier and heavier. At least for 26, we're coming down on wheel weights and brake weights and suspension weights. So that might be a help.
Yeah, it's one of those things that has improved so much over this. I think the wheel tethers, did they come in with the narrow track cars in '98? It was that sort of time. Always dangerous to rely purely on the memory, but they've added more. And of course, in terms of wheels coming free, it depends what they're tethered to as well. It's not just the strength of the tether. You can tether something to another thing, but if one of the things it's tethered to has a failure in a certain way, it can have problems. But yeah, this is right at the top of the priority list, because big heavy wheels flying all over the place is the obvious terrible safety risk, so that they do everything they can to keep on top of that. Well, thanks for all your questions, and thanks to Mark for stepping in. You did a good job of stepping into Gary's shoes. Gary will be back for our next podcast in a couple of weeks' time, so keep an eye out for that one. And also do subscribe to the feed so you never miss an episode. And if you want more from me and Mark, why not join the Race Members Club, where we bring you plenty of bonus podcasts. You can now find us on Patreon as well as Apple Podcast. Links are in the description to this episode. Well, that's all for this week. See you next time, when Gary will be back.
The Athletic.